welcome, Steve. So glad you could be here with me today.
Good to be here.
Yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about mandatory reporting in safe sanctuaries, and I think it's an important thing for the church and for us to understand because there can be a lot of confusion about who our mandatory reporters are. And I'm just going to dig right in with the first question for you. So what should leaders look for in state laws about mandatory reporting?
I think the first question, if I was a leader, would be to ask the question, who should report? Which brings me to have to say to you that there are 50 states and there are 50 different laws. So for those people who see this video, it's good to look at your specific state law. Even though there's not a mandatory reporter listed, it's also important to know that anyone can report at any time. And some people forget that. And I think that's an important thing, especially for those of us in the church to remember.
Absolutely.
The standard for reporting is different in different states. For some, it is a reporter must be acting in an official capacity and has a reason to suspect or believe that a child has been abused or neglected. In other states, it's a different standard. It's a standard to report when the reporter has knowledge of or observes a child being subjected to conditions that reasonably one would expect would result in harm to the child. Those are not just word differences, they are standard differences.
Absolutely.
What I always tell clients is if you have a doubt about reporting, then it's easy. Just simply report.
Absolutely. That's good advice, great advice. Another question, because there's so much confusion about people who serve and volunteers and substitute teachers, people don't know, does that mean that I'm a mandatory reporter? And I get that question a lot.
It's very possible in state law that the volunteers will be specifically delineated, but even if they're not, in most instances they do come under a category that is listed. So whether you are there with pay and an employee or a contractor, or whether you're a volunteer, I always tell people, again, err on the side of reporting.
Absolutely. Agreed. Now, one of the things we don't think about a lot of times is the consequences. There are consequences of not reporting, correct?
There are, and there are an increasing number of cases and settlements related to cases relating to the non-reporting issue. 47 states have penalties for knowingly or willfully failing to report. Oftentimes you can go to jail or pay fines for failure to report. Recently, a couple years ago in California, as an example, a principal didn't report when an 8-year-old girl told him explicitly about a possible sex act that was done by a teacher. The principal was found guilty of non-reporting, faced up to 6 months in jail and a $1,000 fine. In the end, received 2 years of probation, 100 hours of community service, and what was even worse, another person was abused before it was all sorted out. So the whole negative consequences of non-reporting are not only to the non-reporter, but to the children who are involved.
Yeah, it's a human cost.
It is.
It really is.
And we know from studies what that cost is to children.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Now, as we're looking at children and adults, are there any differences between reporting child abuse and elder abuse or incapacitated adult abuse?
As you can imagine, these questions vary again by state, and you have to look at your state law. What you need to look for is the definition of elderly and the definition of elderly residing in a facility, of what is a vulnerable person in that state, who is a caregiver, and who is required to report. So far as I can tell, these laws came into vogue a bit after the laws relating to child abuse. So they're still in their formative stages, and therefore the differences between states are greater.
Right, okay. Okay, well, thank you. We have one more question for you today. So Steve, who should people report to?
Certainly if there's an emergency, you call 911. and you get it to the police as quickly as possible. If it's a child and it's not an emergency, most states have child protective services. If it's a vulnerable adult, most have adult protective services, but those calls need to be made.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. This will help the larger church to understand a lot more about mandatory reporting. And Steve, you're a blessing to the church.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure talking to you.